Good afternoon and welcome to Praxis Peace Institute's Friday program on Zoom. I'm Georgia Kelly, the director of Praxis, and today we are thrilled to host Margaret Randall, the author of Risking a Somersault in the Air, Conversations with Nicaraguan Writers. Margaret is an author, feminist poet, essayist, translator, and social activist. She has lived a most colorful life, Mexico in the 1960s, Cuba in the 70s, and Nicaragua in the 80s. She returned to the US in 1984, only to fight a deportation, which we might talk about today. She is the founder and former editor of the bilingual literary journey El Corno Emplumado, the Plumed Horn, which began an iconic bridge between cultures in the 1960s. Her recent book, which we will be talking about today, looks at the writers, activists who were involved in the 1979 Nicaraguan Revolution. She has been on an extraordinary journey, one that will give us a close look at politics, poets, and revolutions in Latin America. So welcome, Margaret. It's wonderful to have you with us today.
Thank you, Georgia. It's lovely to be here.
I want to start with a couple of questions about a little of history so people have a background of what we're going to be talking about today. Maybe we can start with the Sandinista Revolution. Give us a short context for the poets we're going to hear about today. Might be good to start with the assassination of General Augusto Sandino, who the Sandinistas were named for, and why you think their revolution was so successful in overthrowing Somoza in 1979.
Okay, well, I'll try to encapsulate that as briefly as I can. Nicaragua is the largest country in Central America. It is a country that is made up primarily of Spanish origin, but it has English-speaking and native peoples on the Atlantic coast. It is a country rich in natural resources. And at one point in the 19th century, it was proposed as the place for an interoceanic canal. Of course, that canal was ultimately decided upon in Panama instead of Nicaragua, but there was a time when Nicaragua was particularly interesting to the United States because of the possibility of placing a canal there. The 19th century actually showed some pretty outrageous actions by the United States against Nicaragua, one of which was the fact that a North American, William Walker, actually became president of Nicaragua for a short time. In other words, a North American was president of a Central American country. His presidency didn't last very long, but the US did support this dynasty of the Somozas, the Somoza family, which was a dictatorship that passed from father to son to grandson and so forth, and really kept the people of Nicaragua enslaved, such that it had very low statistics in terms of disease, education, healthcare, and so forth and so on. In the 60s, in 1961, a group of young, well, first I should say, you mentioned Sandino. General Sandino was a Nicaraguan who actually turned out to be the only local person to eject the Marines, the US Marines, from his country. And in 1934, he got rid of the Marines, he got rid of US occupation, and proposed a government that would have been, or it seems that it would have been a much more participatory government concerned with justice and so forth. But again, the US stepped in and murdered Sandino in 1934. So Sandino then became this legendary figure in Nicaragua, representing the struggle for justice. In 1961, the Sandinistas, a younger generation of young people, founded the FSLN, the Sandinista movement, that later became a political party, but at first it was just a fighting force. And as I say, it was founded in 1961, and it had its ups and downs. It had many defeats. And finally, after many years of struggle, won a revolutionary war in July of 1979. So the Sandinistas, of course, are named, they take their name after Sandino. But it's interesting when we talk about the Sandinistas, because I think in 1979, in the 80s, even in the 90s, it was logical to talk about the Sandinistas. It's really no longer logical to speak that way today, because the original Sandinista movement, the people who rule Nicaragua today, Daniel Ortega and his wife Rosario Murillo, call themselves Sandinistas, and indeed they were part of that effort in the 60s and leading up to 1979 that won the war. But they have really broken with all the tenets, everything that Sandinismo represented. And although they continue to call themselves Sandinistas, they really are a dictatorship. And proof of that, well, there's many, many proofs of that, but one way we can think about that is that most of the original Sandinistas have broken with Ortega and Murillo, and are either in prison or have been recently released with this big prisoner release about a month ago, or they are in exile. They went into exile before they had a chance to, before Ortega had a chance to imprison them, or they're dead. So the original Sandinistas, the people who earned that name by their sacrifice and their struggle, really don't identify as Sandinistas anymore. And we have this dictatorship that it's important to understand that Nicaragua now is living in a condition of state terrorism.
Okay, that's very interesting. And I wanted to mention, just before we go into some of the poets, some of the good things that the Sandinistas did manage to do in Nicaragua. And you mentioned that too in your book. They built schools, they increased the literacy rate tremendously, built roads, and generally lifted the standard of living quite a lot in Nicaragua. So maybe just before we go into the poets, if there's anything you'd like to comment. I mean, there was also support for artists, which I think is very unusual. We certainly don't see that here, which not just support, but financial support, which I think is really commended. So would you want to say anything about that? That I found that really interesting, that they were able to change the material livelihood in the country so quickly.
Absolutely. I mean, I was in Nicaragua at the end of 1979 for several months to do the fieldwork for a book called Sandino's Daughters, a book about women in the revolution. And then I went to live there at the end of 1980, and I lived there for a number of years. And during those early years, the revolution was extraordinarily exciting. I mean, everything that a whole series of communicable diseases were eradicated. The literacy campaign took place, as you mentioned, and literacy illiteracy was virtually eradicated. Land reform, there was a land reform program that was very successful. Schools were opened up, education was made more accessible, healthcare. You know, it was just an exciting period in which anything seemed possible. And as you said, also, and this of course was important to me as a poet, being an artist, being a writer or artist or musician or sculptor or any kind of a creative person in Nicaragua at that time was extraordinary, because the revolution supported artists with actual monthly stipends. It the Ministry of Culture. I think that might have been the first Ministry of Culture to exist in Latin America. And the first Minister of Culture, Ernesto Cardenal, was a world famous poet, priest, a very important figure in the Sandinista movement and outside the Sandinista movement. And he just did all kinds of things. He had all kinds of initiatives, like poetry workshops all over the country. There were workshops in neighborhoods and military units and in factories, workplaces, on farms. He supported visual artists and musicians and dancers, and even the circus. I mean, there was a movement to support the small local circuses that existed throughout the country, craftspeople. So, you know, it was a time of tremendous a flourishing of the arts, of respect for the arts. I remember poetry readings where, you know, it wasn't unusual to have a couple of thousand people. Managua, the capital of Nicaragua, has a beautiful, beautiful theater in the center of the city. It's interesting because there was a tremendous earthquake there in 1972, and this was one of the few buildings that was not damaged by or demolished by the earthquake. And the Ministry of Culture used to produce events there at which you know, thousands of people came. They invited artists from all over the world who appeared. Allen Ginsberg came from the United States, Mercedes Sosa from Argentina, Vosnesensky from the Soviet Union, Joan Baez, also from the United States, Gunter Grass, just some of the names that I remember. And one of the wonderful things about those events at the National Theater was that the ministry reserved the first 2 rows for street kids. Of course, all of the events were free as well, but you know, I could just go on and on about what a wonderful time it was for creative people, not just Nicaraguans, but also those of us visiting or living in the country at that time. And that was one of the things that inspired me to write this book, to interview some of the high-level people in the Sandinista government, and that original Sandinista government, who happened to also be poets and writers and so forth.
When you talk about 1,000 people showing up for a poetry reading, that's just unbelievable. Never would happen in this country. To think of the arts being so respected and revered and part of the culture, not set aside from the culture like it is here, that's just very inspiring to hear. I was going to ask.
The respect for the arts was so incredible. I just want to say, mention one brief addition to what I just said, which is that the idea of being called poet, you know, was such an honor, was such a privilege that, you know, Ernesto Cardenal, as I mentioned before, was a priest. He could have been called Padre Cardenal because he was a priest, or Minister Cardenal because he was a minister of state, but he preferred to be called Poet Cardenal. And that sort of just goes to show the respect for the arts.
Yes, I thought he was particularly interesting of all the poets that you interviewed in your book, which I think is an extraordinary book, and I do want to recommend it to people. Risking a Somersault in the Air. But Cardenal, I guess, just passed in 2020. He was 95, it looks like. But he also spent time at Thomas Merton's monastery in Kentucky, which I thought was interesting. And he actually said something about propaganda. He wanted to write poetry, but he didn't want to write propaganda poetry. And so I'm curious, did he manage to succeed in writing poetry that wasn't propaganda?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, Cardenal is one of the great voices of the 20th century and 21st century. He has many, many books of poetry. I would say that there's not a single one of them that could be called propaganda. He was a great poet. And yes, he was very close to Merton. And he spent almost over a year at Gethsemane, where Merton was the Trappist monastery where Merton lived. And he and Merton had a plan. They hoped to, this was in the early 60s, they hoped to, Merton was going to leave the monastery, and he and Cardinal were going to found a contemplative community on an island in the Great Lake of Nicaragua. Merton then traveled to Europe and Asia, and unfortunately died in an accident there. So it then fell to Ernesto Cardinal to establish this community himself, which he did on the little island called Solentinami. And he was there for several years. And I actually have a book called Christians in the Nicaraguan Revolution, which interviews people from that community and from another Catholic-based community in Managua. Liberation theology was big in Latin America at the time, and very important also in the Sandinista Revolution. So yes, you know, Cardinal became a great poet of my generation, and sadly, in his last years, he was very frequently attacked by Ortega. In fact, Ortega paid for a group of thugs to attend his funeral, shouting epithets, a traitor and so forth, when Cardinal died. But those acts are just sort of typical of the dictatorship, and Cardinal certainly will go down in history, or has gone down in history, as being beyond all that.
Great. I wanted to probably skip around a little bit, and I don't know that I'll get to all five because there's so much to talk about otherwise. But one of the next poets I want to go to, we don't have to spend much time on him, but I'm just curious. His name is Omar Cabezas, and he talks about the literary boom in Latin America. And he mentions Garcia Marquez, Vargas Llosa, Carlos Fuentes. I'm going to add Isabel Allende, because he talks about magical realism, which I'm a real fan of. I love magical realism. And I think the Latin American writers who have written in this style are just extraordinary. So he wrote a book called Fire from the Mountain, The Making of a Sandinista. And he said something that I think is really interesting. Quote, he said, that a revolutionary likes this book is not hard to understand, but that a bourgeois person comes to understand the revolution through reading it seems extraordinary to me. I'd like you to comment on that, on people who might not be so clued in to the revolution, how they are affected by poetry or by art, and how it might change the way they see things.
It is an interesting quote, Georgia, because Omar Cabezas, when I knew him, was a high official of the Ministry of the Interior. He was a military man. He had been a guerrilla in the revolution, and then when the victory came, he remained in the military. And but he was also a born storyteller. He was quite a character, and he actually didn't write this book that you mentioned. He dictated it to his secretary, which was, you know, it was his process. It was the way he could do it. And so what he was basically doing was telling these marvelous stories that are autobiographical, and they're also magical realism in the sense that, I mean, they're realism, they're true stories, but Nicaragua is a very magical country, and realism there is magical. And the book was instantly extremely popular in Nicaragua, and then it was translated into many languages, including into English. It was published here, and I think it was a bestseller for a while here. After that, I believe he wrote one more book, which was not as popular as his first book. And eventually, with the demise of the Sandinista movement, he sort of retired from politics. It's interesting because in this book of interviews, and I say this in my update in the chapter about Omar, he doesn't really say where he stands politically. So he is one of the few people, or the only person perhaps in this book, who I do not know whether he still supports Ortega or he has broken with him.
Yeah, that's interesting. Now I want to go to one of the women poets that you wrote about. I found her really interesting, Gioconda Belli, who is still alive. And she made some remarks about artists becoming conscious of the fact that their work, although created individually, comes out of a social practice, which I thought was very important. And then one of the things that I think as women, there are not so many women on the call, but we'll be listening to it, is what she calls the machismo in her society. And I think this is really important. She says that women may have earned an equal place in her country and her society, but it comes at a cost. That is, the ordinary man sees her as an equal, therefore not quite as a woman, because they see women more as submissive, who stay home, who behave in a traditional way. And she says men have not learned how to overcome their fear of women who are their equals. I would like you to comment on this, because I think this is very pervasive in Latin culture. Of course, it's everywhere, but probably more so there. So I'd like to get your take on it.
I don't really know if it's more so there or more so in the United States. I mean, I think patriarchy is strong everywhere, with its idiosyncrasies in every part of the world. One must bear in mind that that interview, that conversation that I had with Gioconda took place in 1983. So the revolution was still strong. It was still in power. And so when she talks about the machismo and the way of the men see women, and so forth and so on, she's talking from that moment. And when she talks about writing being inspired by social commitment, she's also talking about that moment. Gioconda went on to continue writing. She broke with the Sandinistas in the mid-90s, as many of these people did. And she wrote a book long after this book was originally written and released. It was a memoir called "The Country Under My Skin," which I think, which has been translated into English. It's available also in a number of languages. But it's really a book worth reading if you want a glimpse into machismo among the original Sandinistas, as well as just in the society in general. It's a book that was very controversial when it was published in Nicaragua for obvious reasons, and I think it's really quite an extraordinary book. Gioconda's poetry is unique in that it's been put to music on many occasions. I've heard it sung by hundreds of thousands of people in the public square in Nicaragua in the early years. So she's a voice that continues to be very active, and both politically and literarily, and just as a real force.
Does she still live in Nicaragua?
No, none of these people can live in Nicaragua. They have all either gone into exile voluntarily after the crackdown in 2018, or they were, forced into exile more recently. She has a home in Nicaragua, which she has, but she's been stripped of her citizenship, as have many of these people. All of Ortega's opposition has been stripped of its citizenship, of its pensions, of its properties, and she lives in the United States.
Okay. And then I wanted to mention, before we go into questions, I wanted to mention Daisy Zamora, who is another female poet from Nicaragua, but also lives now in the US. In fact, she lives in San Francisco, so she's in our area, and is taught at San Francisco State University. And she says something that I thought was quite interesting too. She says, "I think what's so marvelous about poetry is it makes you pay attention. It awakens you to things you might not ever notice. And it gives you detail and enables you to write about those details from a fresh point of view." And so that's kind of the way a poet sees the world, or the way an artist of any stripe probably sees the world. in a different way, or they pay more attention. I don't know if you want to comment on that, because I have one more poet I want to go to, and then we'll open it up to Q&A.
Well, I'll just briefly say that Daisy is also a marvelous poet. Her poetry is more intimate, perhaps, than Gioconda's. She was also deeply involved in the Revolutionary War. She was the voice on the clandestine radio during the last period of the war. She is career-wise a psychologist. Her degree is in psychology, so that would probably that's probably one of the reasons that she talked about paying attention and noticing things. But she continues also to write and to teach and to and has also been stripped of her citizenship, and is in the same situation basically as most of the other people in this book.
Yeah, and I noticed that all of them seem to revere Cardinal in the interviews you did with them. And the last one I just wanted to bring up, but there are many others in her book, so I want to highly recommend this book. Sergio Ramirez, who founded the Ventana literary movement. And he talked about having an anti-dogmatic approach to culture and politics. And that seems to require quite a lot of self-reflection, study of culture, history, and politics. So I'd like you to explain a little bit about his fervor in supporting and being part of the Sandinista Revolution, and his anti-dogmatic approach and where that led him.
Well, Sergio is not a poet. He's a novelist, a wonderful novelist with a worldwide reputation. Again, his books were available in English. He founded Ventana when he was very, very young at the university. It was a group of very young writers, but he went on not just to be a Sandinista, but to become vice president of Nicaragua during the original Sandinista years. And he left Nicaragua several years ago, forced out by Ortega. And he, has maintained a position of tremendous integrity and has continued to write. And his most recent novel, I'm blanking on the name of it at the moment, but it would be easy for your viewers to look up. It's very much based on the peaceful demonstrations of 2018 that led to this latest crackdown, and so it's an interesting novel. And I believe he's living in either Spain or Costa Rica.
Yeah, the last I saw was Spain. I think he has relatives there. So I'm going to now open it up to Q&A from the audience. So anyone who wants to ask a question or make a comment, this is the time to start doing that. And before I see any hands, I'm just going to mention the book again, Risking a Somersault in the Air. Margaret interviews several poets, writers from Nicaragua, many not there any longer, as you noticed from our conversation. I'm going to call on somebody if I don't see a hand. So, okay, I'm going to go to Howard, and Jeffrey, get prepared because I'm going to call on you after that. So Howard, you're first.
Okay, I did have the pleasure once of sitting at a poetry reading with 1,000 of my closest friends when a poet did a reading that you've, I'm sure, heard of, Octavio Paz. And Octavio got kind of crosswise with Castro. And given your background in Cuba in the 70s, and coincidentally, the reading that Octavio did that I was present at was in the late 70s. Can you comment on his not only poetry, but philosophy and politics?
Well, Octavio Paz, of course, is was a very important Mexican intellectual poet, wonderful poet, a very well-known essayist. Some of his essays about Mexico and Mexicans are considered among the best there are. He was not a supporter of the Cuban Revolution or Fidel Castro. He was really not a supporter of revolution. So he would be, if we were going to use labels like right and left, which may not be so useful anymore, but I would put him on the right. And nevertheless, I admire his work. I think he contributed a great deal to Mexico, to Mexican literature and thinking. But you know, we all come from different political positions, and he was not a lover of revolution or of Cuba.
Okay, Jeffrey, do you have some comments you'd like to make since you were just in Nicaragua? You need to unmute, Jeffrey. Okay.
Yes, I went to Nicaragua initially in 1983, really the tail end of what I call the euphoric stage of the revolution. I remember the incredible spirit and the in the mass demonstrations, the celebrations were just amazing. And reading the book, which I've just read, I hadn't read it before, just brought me back to that kind of euphoric stage. But I've been living in Nicaragua for now since 1983. I'm in England right now, but I'm here for medical reasons, and I will come back. I mean, I have a farm in Nicaragua, I have a business in Nicaragua, I have a wife, a family, I'm married a Nicaraguan. So I've lived there for a long time. And I have obviously a different perspective. To go back a little bit, I went to Nicaragua in the Solidarity movement. And in the Solidarity movement, our philosophy was we took orders basically from the government. If they told us they needed this, we did it. If they told us we needed that, we did it. We did not question them. And that may or may not have been a problem, but it was our position in the Solidarity movement. The other thing is that I spent most of my time in Nicaragua, where I live now, which is in Matiguas, which is in the central part of Nicaragua, in basically a farming community. So I have very little contact with the Nicaraguan Sandinista culture in Managua. My contacts were more in the campesino culture in the countryside. And I did work with the government for a number of years, basically in programs such as the Hambre Zero, anti-poverty programs, which helped campesinos in the countryside, economic development programs, basically. I also spent a lot of time on the Atlantic coast, especially after the Hurricane Juana, when the government asked us to go out to the coast and help in the reconstruction there. So I've spent a fair amount of time, but not, as I say, in the culture of Managua. Now,
This is the hard part, right?
this is the hard part. Yes, this is the hard part because, you know, you hear about the imprisonments and the expulsions and the taking away of the citizenship of people like Sergio Ramirez, who I had met a number of times, and you know, it does provoke attention. It does provoke attention, but you have to realize one thing, that the Sandinistas, and I still call them the Sandinistas still have a war mentality. They are still consider themselves to be in a struggle against the United States. And that struggle is real. That struggle continues. The United States has not given up trying to overthrow the Sandinista government. And many people in Nicaragua have had to make that difficult choice of do we stay, do we leave, do we stay working with these NGOs that are funded by the Foundation for Democracy, which is basically a CIA organization. There's a tremendous amount of underhand stuff going on in Nicaragua. And that is the response, maybe a little extreme, but it is a response of a struggle mentality. It's a response of a government that feels itself threatened and feels itself still liable to be overthrown by the forces of imperialism.
Yeah, I think
I'll stop there, but I don't want to go on. I could go on.
this is a good juxtaposition. So
Yeah.
Margaret,
I'd like to, I'm very appreciative of what you just said, Jeffrey, and I think it's important to address that. First of all, the Ortega and Murillo have shut down 3,400 NGOs. Certainly not all of those are funded or were funded by the Foundation for Democracy. It has closed the public universities and then opened them. It fires doctors who attend to the wounds of pro-opposition people and teachers who permit that kind of a discussion in their classroom. So I understand that. I understand the war mentality. I lived in it for 4 years. But I'm one of these people who is absolutely against US intervention, US imperialism in whatever form it shows itself. And I think that my credentials in that respect are pretty well known. But I don't understand why it has to be an either or situation, especially from those of us on the outside who have been involved in solidarity. I agree with you that perhaps we should have asked more questions back then, but we did understand that as outsiders, we were there to help, not to direct. And I think, and I too, you know, if the Sandinistas said we need this or do that, I too obeyed. But I've come to believe that we can be against dictatorships where they show themselves, wherever they are, and be against US imperialism. I just don't think that's an either or situation. I really do believe that to pose it in that way shows a kind of binary thinking that just misleads us, you know. And I'm sure there are many people like yourself in Nicaragua who continue to be involved in good projects and that good projects continue to exist. I don't doubt that at all. I think it's a very complicated situation, but I think that it hasn't just been the deaths, the imprisonment, the torture, the expulsions, the denials of citizenship, of pensions and so forth. It's been so much more. And I think that there's no way really of justifying any of that. You know, the Sandinistas in '79 started many programs, which, and some of which continue today, and change isn't made in a decade or 2 decades. It takes a long time. So some of the things, the positive things that we're seeing today are not because of Ortega and Murillo. They are projects that started a long time ago and are bearing fruit. And I agree, those projects exist and they should be supported. But I think that the dictatorship has more than shown that it is robbing the country blind.
yeah, I think this is an interesting discussion. And one of the things you brought up just now, which I think is very important to hold in our minds, is we've all been trained in this binary thinking, good or bad, or this is something that the complexity of situations like this, and also the Russia-Ukraine war, the complexities of these require that we get out of binary thinking and really hold different ideas at the same time that may be contradictory. I do know organizations like the National Endowment for Democracy, definitely a CIA front. I've seen them operate in Yugoslavia when I was there. So I know how those organizations work and certainly support them being expelled from a country. But that doesn't mean taking people's citizenship away. That's a whole other level. So I'm going to go to Brian right now. You want to unmute?
Yeah, Margaret, thank you so much for being with us today. I could spend hours with you. This has been fantastic. So, two quick questions. Are you surprised that Daniel Ortega went from one extreme to another, since he led the revolution to being this dictator? And the second question is, do you think the US is still very involved in wanting to overthrow the government in Nicaragua?
Thank you for those questions. Yes, I'm not surprised by Daniel Ortega. I'm surprised that those of us who now can see who he was and is didn't get it sooner. Daniel Ortega didn't just turn into a dictator overnight. He has a long history of little by little destroying anyone who stood in his way of absolute power in Nicaragua. I mean, he in his first run for the presidency, he way back in the 80s, he opposed Vilma Núñez, the head of the Nicaraguan Human Rights Organization, when she tried to oppose his candidacy with her own, and also Harry Luitis. He was able to just sort of push Vilma Núñez aside, but Harry Luitis actually did engage in a campaign of his own and then died under suspicious circumstances before the election. Daniel Ortega also began, once he became president again, especially after 2007, he began to make pacts with people like Arnaldo Alemán, ex-president of Nicaragua, who is absolutely a fascist. Ortega always opposed him in the past, but then he made a pact with him and released him from prison. He pacted with the hierarchy of the Catholic Church in Nicaragua, which had always been on the opposite side. So he began to pact with these other powers, which showed, his greed for power and his absolute disregard for any kind of morality. So, so his recent actions have not been all of a sudden. They haven't been new. He's been preparing this every step of the way, changing the Constitution on a number of occasions. First of all, to assure that he could be president for life. And then recently as February, as last month, saying that he was going to change the Constitution again to make his wife, Rosario Murillo, co-president instead of vice president. I don't know what this speaks to. I mean, it may speak to the fact that he's sick and wants her to automatically succeed him. I don't know. So I don't have all the answers. But again, I would like to say that 3,400 NGOs, many of which made life for Nicaraguans better in all sorts of areas, education, outreach, women's issues, health, and so forth. They were not all funded by the Endowment for Democracy. And I agree that the Endowment for Democracy is a CIA fund, and I deplore it. But I think this generalization gets us in trouble. You know, if one or two or a dozen NGOs are funded by the CIA in whatever circuitous way, we've got to understand that. But 3,400 were not. And for all of these people now, close to 400 people being stripped of their citizenship, their pensions, their possessions, their property, that's just not something that's acceptable. I mean, those are the acts of a dictator. And there's no getting around that. And there's no reason in my mind to stop being against US imperialism, of course we must be against it. And of course I understand that that the United States is still involved in trying to depose the Sandinistas, right? But I think we can criticize dictators too.
All right, Philip, you want to ask your question?
Yes, just unmuted myself. Margaret, thank you so much for a profound look at the current situation, as puzzling and challenging as it is in Nicaragua. I was just curious about your take on one of those NGOs that was not done away with, not one of the 3,400, namely the Center for Development in Central America, which has been my favorite Nicaraguan NGO ever since I learned of their existence back in the early 2000s. They continue to do very strong public benefit work in education, in healthcare, in the arts, and environmentalism, and so on. So my question is, do you think that they, by virtue of the fact that they continue to exist, have been taken over by the Endowment for Democracy, or the CIA? Is there?
No, I don't. First of all, I must say that I'm not familiar with that NGO, and I believe you when you say that it's doing important work. I'm not in touch with all of these NGOs, obviously, and I don't think that the fact that it continues to exist necessarily means that it's funded by this entity or that entity. I don't want to put false information out there. I do think that in general, if you oppose the Ortega Murillo regime, you will be shut down. If perhaps this organization that you mentioned has been able to stay beneath the radar, or it depends on other kinds of monies, I don't know. And if it's doing good work, which you say it is, I hope it continues to exist. But everyone in Nicaragua, every organization, institution, runs the risk, if it opposes the government, of being shut down. That's all I can really say to that.
Yeah. Thank you.
Do we have any other questions or comments before we finish? Jeffrey?
That was a bit difficult. I think this is not going to be a very popular statement, but I think in Nicaragua you have to distinguish between the establishment of a dictatorship and the establishment of a one-party state. Now, what we have in Nicaragua is, without question, a one-party state. There are nominally another party, the PLC, but basically it's under the control of the Sandinistas. It is a one-party state, no question about it. And anybody who opposes the government, who opposes that one-party state, will be in trouble. No question about that either. But let me tell you one thing. We in England, in the United States, when one government falls and another one takes place, say the Labour Party or the Conservative Party or the Democrats replaced by the Republicans, the country goes on functioning. There is a permanent bureaucracy that enables the country to go on functioning. That is not the case in Nicaragua. In Nicaragua, if the Liberal Party gains, even the street sweepers lose their jobs. Everybody goes, and the members of the other party take over the running of the country. That is severely disruptive. And one of the reasons why I have been appreciative of the last 30 years and the movement, the consolidation of the revolution, is that you have a real continuity and stability. I am very, very impressed by the bureaucracy of the Sandinistas. They have a very, very well-run country there. I mean, I'm sure Margaret remembers the inflationary period there. Inflation now, monetary inflation, is 1%. The devaluation of the quarter in relation to the dollar is minimal. Their macroeconomic policies are excellent, very, very stable. The country is very, very stable. And that is a big, big thing. People want stability. People want security. Look at El Salvador, what's happening in El Salvador. Bukele is a dictator, no question about it. He'll be president for life. But there have been no murders for 2 weeks now in El Salvador. All the Maras are in jail. You have to have stability. You have to have mano duro, as they say.
Well, I'm not sure I agree with you when you say you have to have mano duro, which means a hard hand. I think stability is a wonderful thing, and I understand how that can be good for a country. The Sandinistas established that stability under a collective in the 80s. There was a collective government, and I just happen to think that that's more healthy. I think when it's in the hands of one family, the Ortega family, the Ortega Murillo family, things get, it's not good. You know, it may be good for an individual. It may be good for you living where you live. I don't dispute that. It would be stupid of me to dispute it. And of course, I understand that there are many people living in Nicaragua who have good lives and who are benefiting from this stability. But I think that, and I'm not advocating for our system here either. I mean, I think that our system where we spend billions of dollars on campaigns and switch from Democrats to Republicans and so forth, I don't think that's the answer either. But in the case of Nicaragua, I think it's very troubling that a family has gotten rich with its control of the country, that it controls everything, and that if you oppose it in any way, be it in the press, be it in education, be it in a peaceful demonstration, it's going to go very badly for you. And I think that that's a dangerous thing. And you know, I just think of that old Niemöller quote, when they came for the communists, I didn't stand up because I wasn't a communist. When they came for the Jews, I didn't stand up because I wasn't a Jew. When they came for me, there was no one left to stand up. I think that that's the danger of assuming that everything's okay as long as it doesn't affect oneself.
That's a very good point. I'm going to do a last question from, I've got more people who want to ask questions, so I'm going to ask you, Margaret. We can cut it off after the next one, or we could go on a little longer. It will be up to you. What would you prefer?
No, we can go on for 10 or 15 minutes more. That's fine with me.
Great. Well, you're doing a wonderful job, Margaret. This is a really exciting program. So, Brian, you're next.
Great. Would you comment on back in the 80s when Ronald Reagan had his the Contra War, the freedom fighters, the impact that had on Nicaragua and all the military armaments that were sent in by the United States to overthrow the government back in the 80s?
Well, I was there at the time, and it was a terrible time. And of course, the U.S. support for the Contras took place, as we remember, and as we know by Ollie North's testimony, in spite of opposition in our Congress. So that's an example, I guess, a small example of how one can have a different system of government. But if something's going to happen underhandedly or not, it'll happen. It was a terrible time, and families fought against families, and it was the beginning of the end for for the original Sandinistas. And I think it's had an influence, I think on a personal level, it's been very interesting because many families in which there were Contras and Sandinistas have been able to reconcile in a family sense. They've been able to speak to each other, to reconcile as a family, but it hasn't been so successful at the national level. And this brings up something else that I think we've touched on in this podcast from time to time, the idea of militarization of a top-down government, and how easily that can become a dictatorship. And I think this is a danger when you have armed struggle, which is often the only route possible to, when all legal routes have been exhausted, and a generation believes that the only route open to it is to fight. I understand that, and I've supported those liberation struggles. But when then the victory comes and the new government is still structured out of that military mentality, I think that's dangerous. It promotes top-down organization. It cuts off collective leadership. It cuts off discussion and so forth. And I think that, that's one of the dangers. And I think that that's one of the things that sadly has happened in Nicaragua.
Okay, Howard? Howard, you're next. Where did Howard go?
Oh, I spent 30, 40 years as a scientist. It took me a while to figure out how to unmute myself again. Let me preface my question with, I often formulate a question that people interpret as reflecting my personal position. This question clearly does not. However, all of the arguments you put forth against the dictatorship, against Ortega and his people and so on and so forth, and strong governments, my interpretation of those arguments is that you are also in opposition to the Cuba de Fidel. Is that true?
I lived in Cuba for 11 years and I raised my 4 children there. They were educated there. So I have a complex and different relationship to Cuba and thoughts on the Cuban Revolution. I happen to think that Fidel was one of the great statesmen of my time. I do criticize aspects of the Cuban government, but I would like to see more individual freedoms. But I feel that the fact that Cuba, this tiny little island, 90 miles from the powerful country that has tried to destroy it for 65 years now, still exists. It still has universal health care. It still has free education. It still has so many of the great projects that it started out to have with the revolution. I feel that I have a great admiration for Cuba. So I have both criticisms and admiration.
Well put. And it is a different situation. We took a group to Cuba in 2015, and it was certainly different than I was expecting. And people seemed quite happy there. I mean, everywhere you went, I was very impressed with the culture. So if there aren't any more questions, I think we will finish today. And Margaret, I want to thank you. This has been such an enlightening hour that we've spent with you. And I think everyone really appreciates the time you've taken and the brilliance of your book. Again, I'm going to mention Risking a Somersault in the Air. It's a fabulous look at the artists, poets in Nicaragua, and with an update, because she wrote the book originally a while back and has updates on each of the poems, a new introduction, And it's a really inspiring book. So I highly recommend that. And thank
Georgia, do I have just a moment
Sure,
to,
go ahead.
to plug? I'd like to just give a vote of thanks to New Village Press in New York that published the book.
Right.
Because I think their list is so exciting. It's so far ranging. I mean, they publish feminists, they publish environmentalists, they publish poets, novelists, memoirists, artists. Lynn Elizabeth really does an extraordinary job with publishing books that I think would be hard to publish by most other presses. And she does this absolutely beautiful job physically of producing each book. So I just want to give a shout out to New Village and encourage people to go to their website, look at their list, and perhaps find other books that might interest you.
Thank you for that, Margaret. Yes, New Village Press. I was on their email list for a while, and finally I was really taking a good look at one of the emails, and I thought, well, these are all the writers I'd like to interview. This looks like a great roster of people. So that's how I contacted New Village Press and got to you. So I do definitely appreciate them, and we'll have more of their authors and hopefully Lynn Elizabeth as well on the program. So thank you so much, Margaret, and I will be in touch with you, and I'll also send you the link tonight to this recording.
Thank you, Georgia. It's been great. And thanks to everyone who's been here and to absolutely all the questions, the hard ones as well as the easy ones. I appreciate them all.